Hey everyone, Fat Rice Gum here, and today we're going to be talking about the Valve Games Iceberg. And this iceberg was created by Reddit user Reverse Builder, and I wanted to give credit to Tyler McVicker for creating the 30 canceled Valve games video, which mostly provided the information I needed for at least the bottom tiers. Now, we're going to begin by skipping the first two tiers because, come on, do I really need to explain what Half-Life is? Do I really need to tell you what Portal is? Left 4 Dead? CSGO? And an Artifact? Everyone knows Artifact was dog shit. And look, I'm sorry, I gotta show this chart. If you like what you see, be sure to click the subscribe button, hit the bell icon so you know when I upload a new video. So let's get started with tier 3, and this is gonna be a quick tier because it's mostly games that everyone kind of knows about, and I'll try to get through this segment as quick as I can. So Half-Life Opposing Force is one of 2 expansion packs developed by Gearbox Software. And just like how Half-Life is a scientific term, Opposing Force is a scientific term referring to Newton's third law of physics, where every action has an opposite and equal reaction. So the game follows Adrian Shepard, a soldier in the HECU, who was deployed in Black Mesa to contain all the aliens, the scientists, and all the other fun stuff you get in the Black Mesa incident. However, as in Half-Life fashion, everything falls apart quickly, and Shepard and his squad get stranded onto a facility along with the scientists, which leads them to fight their way out of the facility to reach the surface. Opposing Force's development began when Gearbox Software, which was newly founded at the time, was approached by Valve, who wanted to make an expansion pack for Half-Life as they began to work on other titles. The game was announced by Gearbox in April 1999, with founder Randy Pitchford stating, quote, "Our #1 goal is to preserve the integrity of Half-Life and provide new experiences that expand upon the sensation of the original." And when Opposing Force was released, it was regarded as one of the best expansion packs ever made and helped bolster Gearbox Software's reputation as a new company. Unfortunately, the second expansion pack wasn't as good. Half-Life Blue Shift is the second expansion pack created by Gearbox Software, and this time it follows Barney Calhoun, a security guard at Black Mesa who arrives to start his shift before the incident goes down. The game's title also refers to another scientific term, referring to the decrease in wavelength and an increase in frequency, which makes visible light shift blue. So like the other 2 titles beforehand, Blue Shift shows Barney trying to escape the facility by shooting up some aliens and soldiers and all the like. He then meets up with a scientist, Dr. Rosenberg, who worked on the teleportation technology and the experiment that caused the incident. Him and Barney plan to use a decommissioned teleporter to basically cheat their way up to the surface. So Blue Shift was originally announced as a part of the Dreamcast port of Half-Life. And if you know the story of the Dreamcast, you likely know that this port didn't turn out too well. According to Sierra, they canceled the Dreamcast port due to
changing marketing conditions.
Later on at E3 2001, Gearbox Software announced that they would release Blue Shift as a standalone expansion pack for the PC. And we also got the high definition pack for Half-Life 1 and Opposing Force, which introduced these new weapon and character models, although it did receive a mixed reaction from the community. So Counter-Strike Source was released as a beta for internet cafes that were part of Valve's Cyber Cafe program, or for owners of Condition Zero. Valve later employed Hidden Path Entertainment to provide additional support to Counter-Strike Source, including adding new achievements, adding the revenge system, and adding player stats, and they later went on to co-develop CSGO. You probably bought this specific version of Counter-Strike, probably because you wanted the textures for Gary's mod, maybe you want to play some surfing maps, or maybe even Jailbreak. Or maybe you did play the game and realize how fucking toxic it is. Upon the release of Half-Life 2, many reviewers and players were pretty disappointed at the fact that there was no multiplayer mode yet. So in response, Valve released Half-Life 2 Deathmatch 2 weeks later. And you know, it's just Half-Life 2 in free-for-all deathmatch where you can just shoot each other up, or you could even use the gravity gun to grab toilets, radiators, and a table or some other shit, and you just punt it at other players for shitties and giddies. Day of Defeat is a World War II shooter mod for Half-Life. It's mostly focused on multiplayer, so it would have players taking part as the Allies or Axis as they fight over control points in Europe. It was first introduced as a mod in 2000, and it went through a couple of betas to optimize the movement and the gunplay. And after those few betas came out, Valve became interested in the IP, so they decided to acquire it and hire the dev team as well. They then later released a standalone version of Day of Defeat, similar to Counter-Strike 1.6. Later on, Valve decided they wanted to shake things up, so they wanted to refresh their old gold source games, which leads us right into... It was first announced during the development of Half-Life 2, but after that announcement, nothing really happened until 2005, when Valve later announced that the game had reached its beta stage and would come out very shortly. So they revealed this beta version of the game, and it turns out they just pulled a fucking Half-Life source where they just ported the old game into source with no new graphics, no new gameplay updates, nothing. This rightfully pissed everyone off, so Valve decided to cave in and redid everything to make everyone happy again. And ever since Source was released, we never saw a new Day of Defeat game ever since. Of course, this was around the time when World War II shooters were really becoming mainstream, with titles such as COD World of War, Medal of Honor, Battlefield 1942. There were a lot of World War II games that were coming out. Of course, that oversaturated the market, and that just killed all the momentum that World War II games had in the gamer sphere. They made a little bit of a comeback, but it's mostly a dead genre now. Counter-Strike Condition Zero is a sequel to Counter-Strike 1.6, and in short, it had a fucky development. So let me give you the quick rundown. Rogue Entertainment first announced the game in 2000, however, their lead producer left for Sony, which caused Rogue Entertainment to shut down. This led Valve to give their game to their good old buddies Gearbox Software, who basically did an overhaul of 1.6, including new graphics and explosives such as Molotov cocktails and tear gas. They also had a single-player campaign which was mostly inspired by games such as Tony Hawk Pro Skater and Gran Turismo 3. However, after a few delays, it missed its 2002 deadline, and Valve for some reason decided to give development to Ritual Entertainment, who made a single-player game that comprised up to 20 missions. The deadline was pushed back to 2003, and a multiplayer mode was being developed by Turtle Rock Studios. However, after the game went gold and review copies of Ritual's work were handed out to journalists, it received an average score of 60%, which freaked out Valve, causing the game to get pulled out of gold and basically restart from scratch. Ritual Entertainment would later drop out of development, causing Turtle Rock to take over development of the entire game. They redid the multiplayer, which looked similar to Gearbox's version, and they later added back Ritual's single-player missions as an expansion pack called Deleted Scenes. However, with all this effort, it couldn't escape its average score rating, as it has a 65 on Metacritic right now, with critics citing that although the AI and the maps were pretty cool, the game itself looked pretty outdated, especially because it got delayed so many times. Deathmatch Classic is a game developed by Valve, which acts as a sort of tribute to id Software and Quake multiplayer. The game had 5 maps which were ripped directly from Quake, and it also had its gameplay tuned similarly to Quake. It has the same weapons, and it also uses the same physics, meaning that players could rocket jump and bunny hop around the map anytime they wanted to. And Valve basically made this game for those who want to relive PC multiplayer in the ancient times and get a huge nostalgic boner. We are now on tier 4, and this tier contains games that are mostly well known to Valve fans, but maybe not to really casual gamers, so let's peep this out. There really isn't much to say about this entry. It's Half-Life 1 Deathmatch, but on Source. And yeah, there were some aspects that were removed from the original game, such as the Magnum Zoom feature. And it's just free-for-all deathmatch. You run around the map, shooting people up. There's not really much else I can say. Ricochet is a multiplayer mod for Half-Life where it features players throwing discs at each other Tron style. So you'd have to jump around platforms and knock people off the arena with your discs, and it features one of the most terrifying screams I've ever heard in my life. And yes, it became a standalone after the mod and team were acquired by Valve. And not many people like this game. Some even claiming it's Valve's worst game ever. And because of this reputation, it became the butt of most jokes like Ricochet 2 Electric Boogaloo or Ricochet 2 being a code name for Half-Life 3. Alien Swarm is a top-down shooter where a team up to 4 players can fight through swarms of aliens, get it, as they traverse through an off-world colony. Players get to choose what they want in their loadouts, which includes your typical assault rifles and grenades, and they also get to choose their classes, which includes a special weapons soldier and a medic. The game was originally a mod for Unreal Tournament in 2004. The team later announced there would be a sequel on Source in 2005. However, by late 2007, their development blog stopped posting and they just seemed to mysteriously disappear. It was later revealed that Valve had pulled a Valve and acquired the IP and team behind Alien Swarm. They would then later release the standalone game while they worked on titles such as Left 4 Dead and Portal 2. Aperture HandLab is a VR demo created by Valve and headquartered Games after they released their Index VR headset. The game revolves players testing personality cores by using various hand gestures to see how the core would react. This is of course accomplished by the Index's finger tracking technology on their controllers. Development began in 2014 when Cloudhead Games were invited to the Steam VR Summit by Valve. They later realized in the VR Summit that room scale was the future for VR games. Since that summit, Cloudhead Games had dedicated their time to creating VR demos for major Steam VR innovations. It seems cool to play, but I unfortunately don't own an Index, so if you guys want to donate some cash, won, pesos, or even quid, email me in the description down below. So the next 3 entries are Half-Life games that I talked about in my Half-Life Iceberg videos, which I'll have in a card on the top right up here. So I'm going to skim through these real quick. In September 2003, early Half-Life 2 code was leaked onto the internet, meaning that people can freely download these early builds for them to play. Game Newell then posted online to explain how the servers got compromised and asked for help finding the culprit. Axel Jembe later revealed that he was the one responsible for the hack. The German government then later arrested Jembe in 2006. While all these leaked files take place in different developmental stages, everyone collectively called it the Half-Life 2 beta out of convenience. And to just briefly elaborate the differences between the beta and the final game, the beta is pretty edgy. CD17's art style looked more like a darker, shittier version of New York rather than the usual Eastern European style we know today. The Combine were set on destroying Earth and enslaving people as they drained all the oceans, filled the air with noxious gas, and utilized child labor. There were some cut maps like the Borealis and the Air Exchange, along with cut characters like Captain Vance and Eli Maxwell. Half-Life Decay is a co-op mode developed by Gearbox Software for the PlayStation 2 port of Half-Life 1. 2 players would play as Colette Green and Gina Cross as they try to repair a dimensional tear that happened during the Resonance Cascade in the Black Mesa incident. Gearbox Software wanted to create a cooperative mode for Half-Life 1 while working on the PS2 port. However, they had a hard time figuring out how many players they wanted to use, even though the PS2 only has 2 controller ports. Gearbox then later provided the premise and storyline of Decay at E3 2001. In 2005, a group of Ukrainian developers would later port Decay into the Steam version of Half-Life. Return to Ravenholm, also called Half-Life 2 Episode 4, was a game developed by Arcane Studios, and it would be the game that would bring back Adrian Shepard from Opposing Force, who is now accompanied by Father Grigori. Throughout the game, Shepard and Grigori would travel through a school, a town, an abandoned asylum, and eventually return to Ravenholm. Father Grigori can be seen injecting head crab blood into his neck before turning into this freakish monster right here. And most of the gameplay revolved around electricity. Shepard would have a nail gun which could be used to trigger electric traps or solve electricity puzzles. And he also had a charge gun which released a ball of energy if it was near an electrical source. There were no head crab zombies, but they were replaced with regular zombies which looked more akin to those found in Left 4 Dead. They would have been smarter, faster, and be prone to attack in large groups. They were also easily distracted by flashing lights or loud noises. Unfortunately, Valve decided to cancel the game because they thought that Ravenholm was explored enough in Half-Life 2, much to the dismay of Arcane Studios. We are now on Tier 5, and this tier is pretty short. There's only 3 games in it. Okay, there were a couple of reasons of why I said there were only 3 games on this tier. You know this obviously isn't. For one, I forgot to do the Portal beta entry, and I combined Counter-Strike Online 1 and 2 together into one entry, and I talked about the Half-Life 2 beta like a few minutes ago. So that's why I only said there's 3 games in this tier. Counter-Strike Online is a version of CS 1.6 that was targeted towards Asian markets. And by targeting Asian markets, I meant they had big titty anime girls running around in Dust 2. It was developed by Nexon with supervision from Valve, and it uses microtransactions so you can have a fun time playing the game while spending reasonable amounts of money. It's pay to win. And those poor Asian kids back there, they had to spend money to use weapons that you could have already used in a regular Counter-Strike game. Not to mention all the weird sexy models, weapon skins, power-ups, and all other sorts of weird mystical shit. In 2012, Nexon and Valve announced Counter-Strike Online 2, which would have used the Source engine. Keep in mind, Online 2 and Counter-Strike Source were not the same game. This game was completely rebuilt by Nexon, and of course that game still uses the same pay-to-win credit card leecher sucker fucker. I know you want this. I know you want this. Counter-Strike Nexon Zombies is a game that was released in 2017 and involved big titty anime girls, this time shooting up zombies. And this was the first time a Nexon Counter-Strike was released in the West. Nexon Zombies was later renamed to Counter-Strike Nexon Studios as they wanted to focus more on the modding tools and map creation tools that Nexon created for the game. The Half-Life Beta, more commonly referred to as the Half-Life Alpha or sometimes Half-Life version 0.52, is an early build of Half-Life created back in September 1997. The build was supposed to be released for game journalists, and it was made before the 1997 rework of the game, where Valve basically overhauled the entire game because they felt like it wasn't fun enough. On December 2012, Reddit user Jackal Jazer revealed that he had a copy of this build on a CD disc. They then later uploaded the build online and sold the disc on eBay for $706. The alpha build had 6 chapters that mostly followed the general idea of the final game. There are only 3 weapons in the game: the crowbar, the Glock, and the MP5, all with infinite ammo, by the way. We are now on Tier 6. We're halfway through the iceberg, but we're probably only a quarter of the way in the video, so, you know, if you want to take a break, stretch your legs a little bit, grab some water, a snack maybe, or you gotta use the restroom, don't worry, I'll be right here. I'm not sure why Left 4 Dead 3 is this deep in the iceberg because everyone wants Left 4 Dead 3! It is of course the anticipated follow-up to Left 4 Dead 2, which by the way, came out 12 years ago. And as with any Valve game that ends with a 3, there's been a lot of speculation on its development. When rumors about Source 2 began circulating around the internet, there was a leaked presentation showing a redone version of Left 4 Dead 2's plantation level. It was meant to showcase all the new features of Source 2, such as better lighting, improved physics, better modeling, better text, better everything. And of course, this led to the idea that we might get a Left 4 Dead 3 very soon. We also got tons of pictures of work folders called Left 4 Dead 3 or L4D3, either from visitors who toured the Valve offices or from Valve's themselves when they accidentally leaked a picture of it on their tutorial for the destination workshops. However, we all know it was just a load of copium because nothing happened. We did learn in the final hours of Half-Life Alyx that Valve was in fact trying to make a Left 4 Dead 3. It was going to be an open world game set in Morocco, and it would have featured hundreds of zombies and had full destructible bases. Unfortunately, Source 2 was just not ready for this type of game, and the project just fizzled out of existence. That doesn't mean Left 4 Dead 2 is completely dead. Valve did release a new DLC called The Last Stand, which is mostly a community update which added 2 new campaigns and new maps. There is Back 4 Blood, which was developed by Turtle Rock Studios, who also created Left 4 Dead. And I'm hoping it's good because at the time of recording, it's not out yet. Counter-Strike Neo is a Japanese arcade adaptation of 1.6 published by Namco. The game ran on these arcade machines which basically just look like regular PCs. And they kinda are because they run on Linux using NVIDIA graphics cards. I thought they would have used some gimmicky ass controller like a joystick or a light gun, but you know, you just can't beat good old mouse and keyboard. The game had its online service through Namco's LED Zone, however it ended in 2010. There were even visual novels called Counter-Strike Neo White Memories, which had its own continuity and had segments where you played Counter-Strike in the visual novel. And we're not done with Japanese arcade games just yet. Half-Life 2 Survivor is an arcade game based on Half-Life 2, developed by Valve and Taito. Taito wanted to have an FPS game on their Type X arcades, and they reached out to Valve to see if they can get Half-Life on their new machines. And the controls weren't just your usual mouse and keyboards as I mentioned in the previous entry. It had 2 joysticks for moving and shooting, and 2 feet pedals for crouching and jumping. The game had 3 modes the player can choose from. There's story mode, which provides an abridged story to Half-Life 2, although it's mostly just the combat sections that are presented, and all the scripted sequences were made into skippable cutscenes. There's battle mode, which is a 4v4 deathmatch between players who can choose their classes between medics, snipers, and soldiers. And there's also mission mode, where a team of up to 4 players try to complete certain objectives while beating groups of enemies. And we've just got one more arcade game up our sleeve. Left 4 Dead Survivors or
Left 4 Dead 生存者たち
or Left 4 Dead Arcade is a redesigned version of Left 4 Dead 2 featuring a new cast of characters who were redesigned to appeal to a Japanese audience. The game still takes place in the US, featuring campaigns from Left 4 Dead 1 and 2. The game used Nessia.net to enable online multiplayer, in-game events, and the use of in-game currency called GG points, which allowed players to unlock new weapons, skins. However, the service shut down in 2017, leaving all the arcade games to be limited to single-player or local multiplayer modes. Eventually, in 2019, most of the game files were leaked and were ported into Left 4 Dead 2 using the Steam Workshop. Codenamed Gordon, also known as Half-Life 2D, was a fan game that recreated levels from Half-Life 1 and 2 into a 2D side-scroller shooter. It presents a storyline to the Half-Life games where Gordon and his buddies realize they're in 2D, and Gordon is tasked in finding out on why they're 2D all of a sudden. Development on Codenamed Gordon began in early 2003, where it was originally going to be a 2D platformer. However, after the devs saw ads for Half-Life 2, they decided they wanted to do a parody of Half-Life. As development began, they were noticed by Tim Burns from Nuclear Vision Entertainment, and the company decided to join in development. The game was originally made for the Nintendo DS, but Nuclear Vision was able to contact Valve, who really liked the idea, and they decided to participate in its active development. They assigned animator Doug Wood to supervise the entire production. It was later released in 2004 on Steam as advertising for the upcoming Half-Life 2. They originally wanted this to be an April Fool's joke where on April 1st, Valve would release codename Gordon, pretending that that was Half-Life 2. Prospero was one of Valve's first game designs and was supposed to come out shortly after Half-Life 1. It would have contained extensive exploration, intricate storylines, and psionic powers. However, as the design of Half-Life soon began taking over some of Prospero's goals, they decided to make the game into an MMO where they mixed user-generated and official worlds that could be accessed in an in-game library. And these games would be hosted on multiplayer servers so players can interact with each other. Of course, the game never actually came to fruition, so what it exactly was, we'll probably never know. The Crossing is a cancelled FPS game created by Arcane Studios, who tried to fuse together multiplayer and single-player aspects by having a single-player campaign take place in a multiplayer server. Valve would send their art director Victor Antonov to become one of the game's leads and help Arcane set up the setting of Paris. They would even assist Arcane with implementing the source engine and even had Gabe Newell participate in one of Arcane's meetings. However, they never signed on to be a publisher, which is, by the way, foreshadowing. The game was set across two different versions of Paris. In the modern day version, Paris had descended into chaos following the collapse of their government. The other version takes place in 1307, where the Knights Templar seized control of the French crown. The story would take the player through both versions of Paris. The game was first announced in January 2007, but was put on hold in May 2009 because they couldn't get a publisher to sign on. Most publishers feared that fusing a single-player campaign into multiplayer servers was a bad idea. Arcane would go on to do some contract work for Valve, and The Crossing was officially cancelled. However, Arcane would later achieve their goal in having multiplayer aspects in a single-player game, for which I will quickly be talking about Deathloop. So in Deathloop, Colt, the player, can be hunted down by a rival assassin, Juliana, and Juliana can be controlled by another player. When Juliana decides to hunt down Colt, the level gets shut down, forcing Colt to confront Juliana in combat and having him hack an antenna to escape the level.
When are you going to release Counter-Strike 2?
When I first read this entry, I thought about this clip where former Intel VP Shmuel Eden asks Gabe Newell about Counter-Strike 2. At the time of this clip, Counter-Strike Source was the most recent release from CS, so he's probably talking about CSGO. However, this entry could also be referring to CSGO being ported into Source 2. As of now, it's been a long rumored update to CSGO, where fans clamored for Source 2 because it would provide some performance boosts, either from the better code optimization Source 2 has, or the implementation of the Vulkan API. And of course, a port to Source 2 would improve the graphics of CSGO, but that really isn't an important aspect of the game as a competitive shooter. And just to let you know, CSGO is still running on Source 1, which is at this point 18 years old. There is some evidence that likely points to the fact that Valve may never port CSGO to Source 2. On a livestream, Tyler McVicker claimed that Valve would never port CSGO into Source 2 because it was too much work for them.
What's going on with the CSGO Source 2 story? Okay, I'll just talk about it. Fuck it. There was a meeting and they made a decision because it's too much work. They have a build. They've had a build for like 2 years. And it's not that they can't port the game. It's they can't port the community content.
There was also a tweet from former Valve employee Richard Gelreich, which claimed that porting CSGO into Source 2 would cause tiny details to be changed, which could drastically change the gameplay because of how old the code is in Source 1. F-Stop was a project that was originally going to be Portal 2. It was a prequel set in the 1950s, where a new test subject would be the protagonist, while Cave Johnson would act as the antagonist. The plot consists of Johnson wanting immortality, so he decides to upload his consciousness into an AI, but he realizes how much of his humanity was lost even though he takes control of a turret army in the facility. Valve has kept the mechanics of F-Stop a mystery. Although playtesters liked the idea of F-Stop and its mechanics, they were pretty disappointed that a Portal 2 didn't have Chell nor GLaDOS in it. So Valve kept f-stop under wraps in case they want to use it in another game. They did tease a little bit of f-stop during the Portal 2 presentation at GDC 2012, but other than that, there wasn't much coming from Valve about f-stop. That was until, in December 2019, Lunch House Software announced exposure in a YouTube video demonstrating Valve's f-stop. So basically the mechanic is you take a photo of an object, and after you do so, you can manipulate the object by moving it around and changing its size however you like. Lunch House Software did announce that they were postponing their development in September 2020 because they wanted to focus on other titles. So this exposure video and the GDC video is the most f-stop we're gonna get for some time, unless Valve wants to include it in some VR exclusive title or something. We are now on tier 7. We are getting near the end of this iceberg, but these last 2 tiers are pretty chonky, so get comfy because this is going to take a hot minute. Half-Life Hostile Takeover was a cancelled expansion pack developed by 2015 Incorporated. It would have focused on a G-Man-like character, G-Man 2 basically, who would partially cause the Black Mesa incident and search for potential candidates. The setting would be a support facility called Allied Processing, which housed an interdimensional portal where they get their Zen samples. This is just a little fun fact: the Allied Processing guards would have used Team Fortress Classic models, as Valve had recently acquired the IP. So the player becomes the buddies' guards, and they help them fight against soldiers and escape the facility. Development on Hostile Takeover began after 2015 founder Tom Kaderka met with Gabe Newell after Valve expressed an interest in making a Half-Life expansion pack. The game was never officially announced, so there are only rumors spreading about in game magazines, such as this GameSpot article from April 1999, which simply claimed that 2015 Incorporated was making a Half-Life 2 expansion pack. However, it was later announced in 2000 that the expansion pack was cancelled. Although there was no official reason as to why Hostile Takeover got cancelled, some 2015 developers believed that Valve cancelled the game because they thought they were going to oversaturate the market with Half-Life games. Team Fortress 2 Brotherhood of Arms was the proposed sequel to Team Fortress. However, unlike previous Team Fortress games, it would have emphasized on realism. The game would have had modern military weapons, and the class roles would have been more strict and distinct. For example, the medic could only heal and revive players, and they only had like a pistol for self-defense. And because of this emphasis on realism, players had to use real-life military tactics such as suppressing fire if they wanted to win a match. And to achieve this goal, there would be an invisible player called the Commander. They would have a complete view of the map, and they would have commanded their orders through text or voice chat. In mid-2000, Valve had delayed TF2's development for a second time because they wanted to switch to Source, which is a great segue into... This was first discovered in the Half-Life 2 beta leak. Within the leak, there were models of a human and alien soldier, along with source code of Invasion, which actually featured leftover code from Brotherhood of Arms. The game would have focused on territory control, where players fight over control points and collectible resources. Invasion was ultimately scrapped because Valve decided that the game became too complicated. Some parts of the build were reused in the Invasion update of the final game. Hot Dog was a code name given to a Left 4 Dead VR game, and they named it Hot Dog because the devs were tired of leaks and they thought it would be an interesting name. It was conceived around the time after Valve released the lab, and they wanted to create a AAA flagship VR game. Unfortunately, there isn't much known about the game because it shortly got cancelled afterwards and fell victim to what Valve called the wilderness. Okay, so that kind of came out of nowhere, so let me just explain something real quick. In the final hours of Half-Life Alyx, designer Robin Walker explained that Valve has something called the wilderness, which is basically a lack of focus. So it's famously known that Valve has no bosses, no managers to assign devs to a specific project. The devs themselves get to pick on what they want to work on. This, of course, has its own pros and cons, with one of the pros being that If people do want to work on a project, that means they're genuinely interested and motivated to make the best thing they want to make. But the con is, so Hot Dog fizzled out and most of the devs moved on to other projects. Borealis is a VR game set on the bridge of the Borealis. This game was conceptualized by Half-Life series writer Mark Laidlaw. It's sort of like a Half-Life museum where people will be transported through time and space because of the Borealis' experiment. So you get to see some parts of the 7-Hour War or some battles between the Combine and the Resistance, and even a peek at White Forest after the end of Half-Life 2 Episode 2. You can even go fishing on the bow of the ship. However, this game fell victim to the wilderness as it never really internally took off, and Laidlaw later retired from Valve. RT was a voxel sandbox game that was developed when Valve was still struggling with Source 2. The development of Source 2 was so uncertain that a team decided to create a proprietary voxel engine for the game to run on. The game would have featured full construction and destruction mechanics and would have revolved around a character named King Kevin who would try to escape prison by tearing down walls, building bridges, and shrinking objects. There was even a script written for the game by Jay Pinkerton and Eric Wolpaw, but unfortunately this game fell victim to the wilderness. Later on, RT was revived as a VR experiment, but that really didn't take off and there isn't much known about that. Half-Life 3 Wave is an unreleased mod for Deathmatch Classic. It is of course based off the popular Quake mod 3 Wave CTF, one of the first capture the flag FPS games ever. Its creator was hired by id Software to create a sequel mod for Quake 2. However, the creator then joined Valve and wanted to port 3 Wave onto Half-Life. The mod was abandoned for seemingly unknown reasons. Half-Life 3 Wave was later on discovered in the Half-Life 2 beta leak, but the build found on the leak was pretty much unplayable as it would crash whenever it tried to load into a server. Fortunately, Tyler McVicker and his team were able to restore the build and make it playable. Left 4 Dead Project AR is a concept where one player would fill an empty map with enemies and items for another group of players to play through. This was first revealed when Tyler McVicker interviewed former hardware engineer Jerry Ellsworth, where she briefly described the game.
We took Left 4 Dead and we hacked it apart and took the director out of it, and we were using a wand and we were letting one person sit on the couch while someone else played on the TV. And the person on the couch sitting next to him was dropping health packs and zombies into the map while their friend played on the TV. It was insanely fun. And it's like, yeah, this is the future right here.
Valve at one point had an internal project called Stars of Blood, which would have been a game about helming a pirate ship in a galactic ocean. According to Engadget, Newell said, quote, "We had an internal project called Stars of Blood. It was a space pirates game that never saw the light of day." There was also some alleged concept art leaked onto the internet, and I say alleged because it hasn't been confirmed whether or not it's official. Other than that, there really isn't much known about the game, and it probably fell victim to that wilderness we mentioned earlier. Tier 8. This is it, boys! Let's make it count, play it straight, don't go back, don't hesitate. So Valve attempted to create a Portal game in VR, and that obviously didn't go very far. I mean, just think about it for a second. Can you imagine having a VR headset strapped to your face and you're flinging, flying, going through portals and all that shit? You're gonna fucking vomit all of your $1,000 headset. So this project was first revealed by Robin Walker in an interview with IGN, where they were experimenting with different IPs before they settled on Half-Life for Half-Life Alyx. They considered Portal at first, but I just explained why that wouldn't happen. However, there is a Portal VR game created by Prism Game Studios, who also created the pretty fantastic Portal Stories Mel. It's called Portal Stories VR, which revolved around gadgets such as the Aperture Science Apparatus Retrieval Tool and the Aperture Science Instant Teleportation Device to solve puzzles in VR. Unfortunately, it doesn't have an actual portal gun. Half-Life Tactics was a cancelled game that was supposed to be an exclusive for the Nintendo Switch. So during the development of the Switch, Nintendo went around to companies pitching the console and they approached Valve to get an exclusive for the Switch. They were willing to pay the big bucks, and they wanted Half-Life. And the pitch impressed Gabe Newell and Valve to the point where they made their own Switch with the Steam Deck. This exclusive would have been a top-down real-time strategy game taking place during the 7-Hour War. And there was actually a tutorial that was taking place in Black Mesa prior to the Black Mesa incident. Valve wanted to utilize the unique features of the Switch, such as the IR camera on the right Joy-Con and the touchscreen to provide new ways to control the player's units. However, the game never left the prototyping stage, and it was cancelled between 2017 and 2018. Alien Swarm VR is a proposed project which would have split the game into two modes, a VR section and a regular section. The VR player would act as a director as they spawn enemies in the maps and commanding the regular peasant pancake players where to go. Other than that, there really isn't much information as the game never really got far in development. Codename Margarita was conceptualized after episode 2, and it would have focused on something called modular AI. The only evidence of this project was a demo where it featured Combine soldiers picking up upgrade chips from their dead buddies, along with the player being able to pick up these upgrade chips. There was some source code leaked in the 2012 Source Filmmaker beta, but other than that, there really isn't much known about the project. Project Time was a game led by Ken Swift and her team after they had developed Portal 1. They made this project because they wanted to experiment more with the portal technology they had created. So they decided to tack on a third dimension to these portals, and by third dimension I mean time. So what this new mechanic is that you can record yourself performing an action and have that action repeat itself while you do something else. Imagine you shoot some portals, right? And you're pushing a box through the portal, but when you push the box, it falls into a lava pit. So what you would do is that you would record yourself pushing the box through the portals and have that repeat while you get another set of portals going so you can fling yourself across the lava pit and grab the box. So I believe they had found the new game mechanic that would be incorporated into Portal 2, and Gabe Newell was at first optimistic about it. However, after he played a demo of it, he decided that it would not work. Swift has since left Valve in 2009 and still believes that the game mechanic would still work in another game. On the podcast, Steamcast, Gabe Newell began talking about some concepts for Valve's first game before Half-Life 1. This brought him to a time where he and co-founder Mike Harrington talked about a submarine game. Even further back than Prospero, the other game that Mike Harrington and I were talking about before we'd even had anybody other than us working on it was a submarine game. Mike was absolutely certain there was an opportunity to create fantastic underwater visuals and gameplay. So if people want to know the even further back thing we haven't gotten around to shipping yet, it would have to be the unnamed submarine game. So when Day of Defeat Source came out, it was around a time where World War II shooters were really beginning to become mainstream in the gaming market. And by mainstream, I mean oversaturated, because there were loads of World War II games that soon came out. So this oversaturation kind of killed the momentum for a new Day of Defeat game, and Valve had their hands full with other multiplayer titles like CSGO, Dota 2, and TF2. I'm not sure when a new Day of Defeat game would ever come out, but there is a spiritual successor called Days of War. Days of War is a World War II shooter akin to Day of Defeat that was crowdfunded on Kickstarter. It had a new game engine and featured custom modding tools that would be used to create user-generated maps. Unfortunately, I read the Steam reviews and apparently the game is now dead, as most of the servers were empty and there hasn't been an update in years. There was an unnamed Half-Life 2 episode designed by Warren Spector and developed by Junction Point Studios in late 2005. It would have been about Ravenholm and Father Gregory. The episode was first announced in December 2005 when the company announced that they were working with Valve to develop a new Half-Life 2 episode. In an interview with founder Warren Spector in 2005, he revealed that after several failed deals, Valve came in to help rescue Junction Point Studios by giving them contract work. And in the meantime, Junction Point was also working with Disney Interactive Studios to create Epic Mickey. However, the Half-Life episode became cancelled once Disney acquired Junction Point Studios. On March 2017, the original map files for the Half-Life 2 episodes were leaked, and among those files was a map supposedly from the Warren Spector episode. It would have been set in a snow-covered Ravenholm and had a scripted sequence of the player escaping a warehouse and a train station before going into combat with the Combine. SimTrek was a VR game developed by the team behind the Kerbal Space Program. And because the game was developed by that team, it's safe to assume it would have been some sort of space simulation. But unfortunately, there isn't much known about the game because it was soon cancelled once development on Half-Life Alyx began to ramp up and the Kerbal Space Program team became involved with Alyx. Before Valve began development on Left 4 Dead, they wanted to create a fairy RPG called the Fairy Project. There isn't a lot known about this project as it was quickly abandoned once they got work on Left 4 Dead. It probably just looked like Winx Club, y'all remember what that is. The only mentions of the Fairy Project on record come from Gabe Newell, where he kind of just jokingly mentions it like, yeah, we made a fairy RPG, it's kind of dog shit. In the final hours of Half-Life Alyx, there was a mention of a Source 2 game simply titled RPG. It would have taken inspiration from Dark Souls, Monster Hunter, and the Elder Scrolls. However, it never really took off past the concept stage. They did consider making RPG into a single-player Dota game, which would have featured Axe, a grunt from the Army of the Red Mist. The only piece of evidence of the Dota RPG was concept art drawn by Drew Wolf, which featured characters that would later be incorporated into Dota 2. Thank you for watching my video. Sorry it took so long. College is currently kicking my ass right now and I greatly appreciate your patience. But yeah, just like a quick channel update, I will still be making Iceberg videos, but I'm trying to branch out and experiment a little bit more, like with the format right here. I hope you guys like this sort of nakey, jakey style format. But yeah, like, comment, and subscribe as usual. Check out my Twitter, and I'll see you guys again next time.